Hi, I'm Wanda with Jimmy Branch Homestead, and today I'm going to be canning up beef stew. So join me as we get started. So to start off with, the recipe calls for 4 to 5 pounds of beef stew meat cut into 1 to 1.5 inch pieces. So I bought the stew meat already cut up, saves me a lot of time. And I have a total of just under 8 pounds. I'm going to go ahead and use all of it, even though I'm not making a double batch. I'm making a time 1.5 batch is what I'm making, but we like lots of meat in our beef stew. So to start out with, we just basically fry up the meat in 1 tablespoon or so of oil. If you have to use more in between batches, or go ahead and do so. So you just cook the meat up in batches, and then I'm going to divide between these 2 stock pots. Because I'm doing a batch and a half, I want to make sure I have room to stir stuff up. So this first batch is 2.66 pounds. And that's probably all I'll put in the pan, just to make sure I have room, to thoroughly and evenly cook it. It doesn't even have to be cooked all the way through, because it'll finish cooking in the pressure canner. And I have to bring it to a boil in the pot because we're going to hot pack everything. So I have my jars in the oven. I'm going to turn it on 200 degrees in just a moment. Okay, so the first batch is mostly cooked. There's still some pink in it, and that's fine. Like I said, it's going to process for 90 minutes, so it will definitely finish cooking through that process. So I'm going to dump this first one in the first pot here. And we will get started doing another one. Let's see, that was 2.66, so 3.66. If I cut this one, here, I'll do this one. This one is 1.06 pounds. So I'm going to go ahead and use this one, and that will finish that pot. And I'm actually not going to add salt and pepper because I'm going to add bouillon. And I don't want it to be over salty. Adding a little pepper would be fine, but I'm actually going to wait until I do the taste test to see if it even needs any, because I don't want to overspice it. The original recipe does not call for bouillon. In fact, it calls to cook everything in water, and I just think that would just be too bland, way too bland. We like lots of flavor. So let me go ahead and finish cooking up that pan. Okay, so this one is mostly browned up, and I actually like doing this with the smaller packages better because it gets a chance to actually brown the outsides of the meat. And when it's being canned, that way when it comes out, you'll see some little bit of browning on the meat rather than, I always think it looks anemic if you don't have any browning on the meat when you're canning. Okay, so this will finish off the meat for this pot. And I was so excited, I went to the store to buy more stew meat because I didn't have enough. And I found several packages on manager clearance. So it was just 2 days away from the last sale date. So that was a great win for me. Okay, this one has less than a pound in it, just under a pound. And I'll go ahead and cook up this other meat and stick it in the other pot. And then make sure when you're cooking your meat, you don't just dump it out and leave it in a big clump. You'll want to break it apart then, so it's in the nice individual pieces. And kind of keep breaking it apart as it's cooking so it doesn't just try to cook together in a mass. It's smelling good. Of course, you can do this with venison also. I just happen to have the package of beef and then find more on sale, so that's what I used. I didn't really have any packages of venison stew meat in the freezer. And if you make your beef stew out of turkey, by all means you can do that too. Okay, I have all the meat cooked and divided by my 2 pots. It's in the pots already. And now to that, I need to add 9 cups of potatoes to each pot. So I measured out this one. And I'm going to put the original recipe or the single batch recipe down in the description below because I know it's going to be kind of confusing otherwise because I'm making a batch and a half. So again, the measurements I'm using is for a batch and a half. And I had the potatoes, the peeled potatoes that were peeled and cubed, sitting in water so they wouldn't turn brown until I was able to get them in the pots. More in this one, so these last few will go back in the first one. It's about half a cup. Okay, done with that now. Okay. To move stuff out of the way a little bit to give me more room. Okay, so now at this point the original recipe says to cover the meat and potatoes with water and bring them to a boil. But I am going to use beef broth. I just think water is going to make it so flavorless, you know. And I included any juice that cooked out of the meat that was in the pan. I dumped the whole thing in to give it a little bit more flavor. So we'll see how far I can get with what I have. And we will be adding these other vegetables to cook in as well. We're not going to cook it. We're just going to bring it to a boil. And then we're going to hot pack because everything will cook during the processing. And again, I have my canner on low. I already have the water in there. And my jar's in the oven. And these are each a quart that I'm putting in here. Okay. So now, for my portion, I would be adding 4.5 cups of onions. My husband's not too fond of onions, so I cut it down to 3 cups just for my recipe. You can cut it down if you need to, or you can use this full amount. And I'm just going to divide this in half. Add half to this pot. And half to this pot. And I did dice my onions. You can cut them in bigger chunks if you want. Again, my husband's not too fond of those, so I wanted them too small for him to pick out. Okay, now I am using 4.5 cups of celery. So I'm going to put, again, half in each one. And I have 12 cups of sliced carrots, and I like to slice those about a 1/2 inch thick. I want, chunks. We're making beef stew, not vegetable soup. So I'll put about half in here. Uh-oh, I missed some here. Okay, so that 3 quarts of juice looks like it was just perfect as far as covering up the stew. So I am going to put this one on the burner to boil, and then I'll just finish adding the broth to the other one. Okay, so I am using the Better Than bouillon in addition to the beef stock. Now, if I didn't have the beef stock, I would be using 1.5 tablespoons for each quart. I used 3 quarts of beef stock. I'm only going to add 1 tablespoon per quart, just to give it more flavor. And of course, these aren't going to be exact measurements because it's kind of goopy. It's hard to get exact measurements. Yeah, these are kind of heaping, so I'm trying to clean it off so it's not. Okay, before I do the second pot, I'm going to mix this one up and see how I like it. Take the taste once it comes to a boil. And I should have mixed the meat and the potatoes first. It would have been easier, but I didn't, so I'm having to reach clear to the bottom and mix the meat in it. Okay, so it's just about to boil, real close. So I am going to go ahead and take out jars to fill from the oven. And this can be a challenge. Don't burn yourself. Okay, so this pot has started to boil. I'm going to turn it off and we're going to start filling jars. Excuse me. Also, if you buy jars from Azure Standard, you can order them with or without lids and rings. If you order them with lids and rings, you will get the superb canning lids on your jars when you order them. Okay, so it's time to start filling the jars. Some of my chunks are kind of big, so it's... I did add another tablespoon of Better Than Bouillon to my batch, but keep in mind it's very salty, so do not add salt if you're going to do that. And I wouldn't add it till it tastes good now, because flavors are enhanced during the canning process, and it may be too salty otherwise when you finish processing. So err on the side of less is better, and you can always add more if it's not flavorful enough when you dump the jar in for reheating. And the same goes if you're adding using the bouillon cubes. They're very salty also. Oops. Okay. So we are going to leave 1 inch headspace, which is basically to the top of the shoulder here of the jar. And we are going to debubble. So I'm adding liquid, but when I get ready to serve this, a lot of the liquid will come off. Because we like it as a stew, not as a soup. Okay, that's good. I'm real excited to put these ready-made meals on our pantry shelf. The last several months I've gotten into it more and more, canning with the purpose of making meals. And because this time of the year is so busy, if you're on a homestead or even having a big garden or anything, it's really nice to be able to have a good meal that's balanced, but also quick and easy. Okay, I need liquid on this one. If there are other vegetables that you want in your stew, you know, it's your kitchen, your rules, but just make sure that the processing time matches. You shouldn't have any problems since it has meat in it. It's beef stew. We will be processing at 90 minutes today because we have quart jars in the canner. Okay, so I have all 7 quarts loaded into my canner. And now I'm going to just put this divider on top of the jars. And that's what we will stack the next layer of pints on. So my stuff is boiling. I finished filling that other quart and threw it in there. And now I need to get my pints out of the oven and start filling those. Oops. Okay, so let's get these jars filled. Okay, so I have the 8 pints loaded in on this canner. I am going to put the lid on and turn the burner on high to get it going. Oops. This is sometimes a hard part. You have to just make sure that the area around is level. And that's not always easy. Match up the arrows here on the lid and the indentation here on the pot. Yeah, my gap's wider here than it is on the back. Okay. Yeah, it still is. Okay. That looks pretty level. Yeah, that looks good. Okay, so then I bring them up just to where they hit the lid first time around, and then the second time I will come back and tighten them. Okay. Okay, so now I'm going to tighten them down. Remember to do this across from each other. Okay, so now we just need to wait till it boils hard enough for the steam to be pouring out of the vent, and then I'll bring you back. In the meantime, I'm going to get my other canner set up over here. Okay, so my canner is steaming steady, so at this point I need to set the timer for 10 minutes. It needs to vent for a full 10 minutes. Okay, so my timer's going off. And at this point I'm going to put the weight on. I don't know if you can see the numbers, I don't think you can, but it's 5, 10, and 15 pounds. And for my altitude, I process at 10 pounds. So now we have to wait for the pressure to build up. It'll show on the gauge here, and the weight will start rocking. So once that happens, I'll bring you back and show you. Okay, the weight just started jiggling. The pressure is at about 11 pounds, which is normal. You don't want it to drop below 10 pounds, so it typically doesn't start jiggling until it hits about 11. So at this point, I need to set the timer for 90 minutes because I have quarts in the canner. If I was processing only pints, it would be 75 minutes. But for quarts and pints, I have to take the highest temperature or the highest time, which is 90 minutes. Okay, so the timer just went off. Sorry about that. Okay, so the timer just went off. So at this point, I'm going to turn the burner off, and I'm not going to touch the canner at all. I'm going to let it completely cool before I take off the weight. And since it is late in the evening, I'm just going to leave it here on the stove overnight. The second canner is also done. It had pints in it, so it only required 75 minutes. The quarts needed 90 minutes. So now both canners are completely done. I'll let them both completely cool overnight, and then I'll unload them in the morning, and I'll share with you the results. Okay, so it is the next day, and I let the canners cool down completely before I took the jars out. The jars in the All-American canner are still just slightly warm to the touch, but cool enough to handle. And boy, did that make a lot of meals. So I ended up with 15 pints and 7 quarts. And I did the recipe 1.5 times. So I increased it by 50%. But even then, that should have just been these extra 7 pints. The original recipe said it made approximately 14 pints or 7 quarts. And hello, I ended up with 8 extra pints. So I've adjusted the recipe slightly. I like onions, but it just seemed like there was an awful lot in there still. It had a strong onion taste. So I reduced it from 3 cups to 2 cups. And we like a lot of celery in our beef stew. And when I was ladling it up, I noticed it didn't seem like there was much at all in there. So I increased the celery from 3 cups to 5 cups. So the recipe is 1 tablespoon of vegetable oil, and that's what you are browning the meat in. If you're doing several batches, you may have to add just a little bit. I used a nonstick pan, so I really didn't have to add any. 4 to 5 pounds of stewing beef cut into 1.5-inch cubes. 12 cups of cubed peeled potatoes. Potatoes have to be peeled. So you can't just use baby potatoes and put them in there with the peelings on. For canning, it's not safe. 8 cups of sliced peeled carrots. Same thing with carrots, they have to be peeled. 3 cups of chopped celery. I increase that to 5 for when I make it next time. And 3 cups of chopped onions. I decrease that to 2. And then you can add 1/2 teaspoons of salt, 1 teaspoon of dried thyme, and 1/2 teaspoon of ground pepper. I didn't add any of that because instead, I just thought that would be too bland. I added Better Than bouillon, and I used beef broth for the liquid. So Better Than bouillon was just to kind of give it has the salt in it, so it's very salty, any kind of bouillon is. And it gives it a little bit more flavor. Now don't flavor it strong enough to your liking right when you're putting it, making up the batch, because remember, canning enhances that more and it'll make it taste a little stronger. So you can add to it if you need to when you open the jars, but you don't want it so salty you can't eat it. So then, of course, you would prepare the canner, the jars, and the lids for hot packing. We talked and showed about how to do that. I no longer boil my lids before I'm canning, unless it's pickles. It's going to be a very short time in the processor. And I've not had any trouble with sealing. So I will also add the recipe down below in the comments or in the description box. So if you're enjoying this type of video, please give us a thumbs up, subscribe, and share our videos. It's the best way you can help us to grow our channel. Thank you so much for watching Jimmy Branch Homestead.